Okay, hold on tight, because we're about to dive into such a whirlwind of events it'll make your head spin. Picture this. Rome, the morning of March 15th, 44 BC. The air is thick, like before a thunderstorm, though the sky is clear. In the Curia of Pompey, the Senate's temporary meeting place, senators are already gathering. Their faces are masks, concealing a storm of emotions, fear, hatred, determination, and for some perhaps a secret hope. And then he enters, Gaius Julius Caesar, a figure whose very name made half of Rome's knees buckle, while the other half's blood boiled. He doesn't yet know that this is his last dawn, his last step into the hall where the fates of the world were decided. He walks, as always, with a confident stride, perhaps a little weary. Sleepless nights spent on state affairs, endless plans to reorganize every last thing. He doesn't yet hear the whisper behind him that will, in a moment, turn into the clash of steel. He, the conqueror of Gaul, the victor over Pompey, Cleopatra's lover, dictator for life, the man who made Rome itself bow before him, would in a few minutes be lying at the foot of his vanquished enemy's statue, bleeding from 23 wounds. Talk about a plot twist, right? How did it ever come to this? To understand this bloody outcome, we'll have to rewind the tape some 50-odd years to the day when a boy destined to change the course of history was born into the noble, but not particularly wealthy, patrician Julian clan. Let's get this straight from the start. Our hero, Gaius Julius, was born around 100 BC. The exact date is a matter of debate among historians, but that's not the main point. The Julians, of course, were an ancient line, tracing their ancestry all the way back to Aeneas himself, son of Venus. Can you imagine what an ace to have in the political game? I, you see, am a descendant of a goddess, and who are you lot? But by the time of Caesar's birth, the family's former glory had somewhat faded, and they weren't exactly rolling in money. His father, also named Gaius Julius Caesar, was a praetor and held respectable positions, but never quite made it to consul. His mother, Aurelia Cotta, however, was a woman of character, intelligent, and influential. It was she, in the opinion of many, who laid the foundations of young Gaius's education and instilled in him that unbending will that would later so astound his contemporaries. The family was closely connected to Gaius Marius, the famous general and 7-time consul, who was married to Julia, our Caesar's aunt. And this connection would play a colossal role in young Julius's life, both as a springboard and as a source of mortal danger. Rome at that time was no quiet harbor. It was a seething cauldron of political intrigue, civil wars, and power struggles between the optimates, the aristocratic party standing for the preservation of Senate authority, and the populares, who relied on the popular assembly and demanded reforms. Marius was the leader of the populares, and his confrontation with Lucius Cornelius Sulla, the leader of the optimates, drenched Rome in blood. Imagine this boy growing up in such an atmosphere. From childhood, he saw how easily one could soar to the pinnacle of power and how swiftly one could be cast down from it. He absorbed stories of Marius's military campaigns, of his army reforms that opened up service to propertyless citizens, essentially creating a professional army more loyal to its general than to the state. This was an important lesson that Caesar learned exceedingly well. He received an excellent education, as befitted the scion of a noble family: rhetoric, philosophy, Greek language, literature. Even then, they say, he stood out for his sharp intellect, incredible energy, and a charm that was hard to resist. He knew how to make people like him, how to find an approach to everyone, from a common legionary to a distinguished senator. although his relations with senators were always, let's say, complicated. He wasn't afraid to go against authority if he deemed it necessary. One early story that characterizes him well. When Sulla, having become dictator, initiated the bloody proscriptions, lists of people outlawed and subject to execution, with confiscation of property, he demanded that young Caesar, then about 18 to 20 years old, divorce his wife Cornelia, daughter of Cinna, one of Sulla's main enemies. Many in Caesar's place would have obeyed to save their own skin, but not him. Julius refused. How about that, eh? It was unheard of audacity. Sulla was furious. Caesar had to flee Rome, go into hiding. He was stripped of his property and his priestly office of Flamen Dialis, priest of Jupiter. They say influential relatives interceded for him, and Sulla, reluctantly yielding, prophetically remarked, "In that boy are many Mariuses." How right he was. This early disgrace, his wanderings, the need to rely only on himself, all this forged Caesar's character, taught him caution, resourcefulness, and incredible determination. He understood that in this world, one could only trust one's own strength, one's own mind, and one's own luck. And he also understood that power is not something given, but something taken, at any cost. And even then, perhaps, those grandiose plans began to form in his mind that decades later would bring not only Rome, but the entire known world of that time to its knees. He was not yet the conqueror of Gaul. He had not yet crossed the Rubicon. But the Caesar we know was already beginning to take shape, ambitious, fearless, ready to risk everything to achieve his goal. He was like a coiled spring, waiting for its moment to uncoil with unstoppable force. And that moment was not far off. The Roman Republic, torn by internal contradictions, corruption, and the struggles of ambitious politicians, was itself creating the ideal conditions for the emergence of a man like Caesar. She was sick, and he, paradoxically, could become both her physician and her gravedigger. The beginning of his path was thorny, full of dangers, but he met every challenge with his head held high, turning defeats into lessons and obstacles into stepping stones for his ascent. He learned the art of survival in the Roman political meat grinder, where yesterday's ally could become today's mortal enemy, and a sworn oath was often not worth a brass farthing. He saw how easily the crowd changed its idols, how senators wove intrigues, how money decided, if not everything, then a great deal. And he drew his conclusions. Young Caesar, having survived Sulla's dictatorship and nearly losing his head, understood one simple thing. To survive and achieve anything in this snake pit called Roman politics, one needed to be more than just smart or brave. One needed to be a predator. And he began to hone his predatory instincts. After Sulla's death in 78 BC, Caesar returned to Rome. He was about 22 years old, full of energy, and eager to make a name for himself. And what better way for a young aristocrat with oratorical skills to do this? That's right, court cases. He acted as prosecutor against prominent Sullans, for example, Gnaeus Cornelius Dolabella, accusing him of extortion in a province. Although he didn't win these cases, the judges, after all, were Sullans themselves, he certainly caused quite a stir. He began to be talked about as a bold and talented orator. It was a smart PR move, as we would say today. He showed that he wasn't afraid of the powers that be and was ready to fight for justice, or at least create that impression. To hone his oratorical skills, Caesar set off for Rhodes to study under the famous rhetorician Apollonius Molon, who, by the way, had also taught Cicero. And it was here that an incident occurred that became legendary. On his way to Rhodes, his ship was captured by Cilician pirates. These fellows were a real headache for Rome, controlling almost the entire Mediterranean. The pirates demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver for their noble captive, an enormous sum. And what do you think? Did our Gaius Julius get scared? Not a bit of it. He laughed in their faces and declared he was worth no less than 50 talents. Moreover, during his forced stay with the pirates, which lasted over a month, he behaved not like a prisoner, but more like their commander. He recited his poems and speeches to them, and took offense if they didn't show proper enthusiasm, participated in their games and exercises, forbade them to make noise when he wanted to sleep, and jokingly, or perhaps not so jokingly, threatened to crucify them all as soon as he was freed. The pirates, apparently, were so dumbfounded by such audacity that they treated him with a kind of superstitious reverence. When the ransom finally arrived and Caesar was released, he did not forget his promise. He immediately assembled a flotilla in Miletus, caught up with those very pirates who hadn't even bothered to change their anchorage, apparently considering his threats empty boasts, captured them, and recovered the ransom. And then, as promised, he had them crucified. True, it's said that out of mercy, he first ordered their throats cut to lessen their suffering. That was our Caesar, a man of his word, even if that word was a threat to pirates. This story, of course, added to his popularity. Daring, decisive, unafraid of danger, this was precisely the image that began to form in the minds of the Romans. Returning to Rome, Caesar began to gradually advance along the cursus honorum, the ladder of public offices. In 69 or 68 BC, he became quaestor and was sent to Hispania Ulterior, further Spain. It was there, according to Plutarch's account, while standing before a statue of Alexander the Great, that Caesar wept. To the puzzled questions of his companions, he replied that he was ashamed because Alexander, at his age, had already conquered the world, while he, Caesar, had yet accomplished nothing significant. Ambition, ambition, and more ambition. That's what drove him. Even then, he was measuring himself by the standards of history's greatest conquerors. In Spain, he not only handled the province's financial affairs, but also gained his first military experience, pacifying local tribes. This experience would prove very useful to him in the future. After his quaestorship, he continued to actively participate in Rome's political life. He supported bills aimed at restoring the rights of Marius's supporters, thereby incurring the displeasure of the optimates, but gaining popularity with the plebs. He spent enormous sums of money organizing public games and spectacles as aedile in 65 BC. Romans loved bread and circuses, and whoever provided them could count on their favor. Caesar sank into colossal debt, but his popularity grew. He restored Marius's trophies on the Capitol, which Sulla had removed, a bold and symbolic move. In 63 BC, another important event occurred. Caesar was elected Pontifex Maximus. This was a lifelong and very prestigious position. As head of the Roman College of Priests, it conferred not only prestige but also considerable political influence, as well as an official residence in the Forum. The contest for this post was fierce. His rivals were influential optimates. But Caesar, again, did not skimp on bribes and promises, and he won. In the same year, the famous Catilinarian conspiracy erupted, an attempt by a group of noble but ruined aristocrats to seize power in Rome. When the fate of the captured conspirators was debated in the Senate, Consul Cicero and most senators demanded the death penalty for them without trial. And here, Caesar spoke up again. He delivered a speech in which, without excusing the conspirators, He urged the senators not to succumb to emotions and not to violate the laws forbidding the execution of Roman citizens without a trial. He proposed sentencing them to life imprisonment in different Italian cities. This was a very bold stance, running counter to the majority opinion. Cato the Younger, a staunch Stoic and an implacable enemy of any concessions, attacked Caesar with accusations of sympathizing with the conspirators and even of being involved in the plot. In the end, the Senate voted for execution, but Caesar's speech made an impression. He once again showed himself to be an independent politician, unafraid to defend his point of view, even if it was unpopular. By this time, Caesar was already a prominent figure on the Roman political scene. He was associated with the populares, but tried to maintain relations with some influential optimates as well. He was a master of political intrigue, skilled at finding allies and using them for his own ends. He was charming, generous, especially when it came to gaining popularity, but utterly ruthless when it came to his ambitions. His debts were snowballing, but he seemed not to worry too much. He knew that big money could be obtained by holding high offices, especially proconsular ones, which granted the right to govern provinces. And provinces in those days were viewed by many governors as a source of personal enrichment. Caesar was a product of his era, an era of the Republic's crisis, when old values were crumbling, replaced by cynicism and a lust for power and money. But he differed from many of his contemporaries in the scale of his personality, the breadth of his vision, and his incredible energy. He was not yet the all-powerful dictator, but he was already firmly on that path, sweeping aside obstacles and paying no heed to those who tried to stop him. He was like a shark that had smelled blood in the water, the Republic, weakened and bleeding from internal strife, and he was preparing to strike. So, our Gaius Julius Caesar, having gained political weight, popularity, and debts, of course, continued his ascent. After his praetorship in 62 BC, he was assigned the governorship of Hispania Ulterior, and it was here that he first truly came into his own, both as a military commander and as an administrator. He didn't just sit in his residence counting revenues, though presumably he didn't shy away from that either, as he had to pay off his creditors somehow. He undertook several successful military campaigns against local tribes, expanding Roman influence and, importantly, seizing rich booty. His soldiers proclaimed him imperator, in the original meaning of the word, victorious commander, which entitled him to a triumph in Rome. A triumph. That was the highest recognition of military merit, a magnificent procession through the city, the dream of every Roman general. But here, a snag arose. Caesar wanted both to celebrate a triumph and to run for consul in the elections for 59 BC. And according to law, a candidate for consul had to be personally present in Rome, whereas a general awaiting a triumph had to remain outside the city limits with his army. The optimates in the Senate, already seeing Caesar as a dangerous rival, dug in their heels and did not allow him to register as a candidate in absentia. Caesar faced a choice, either the triumph or the consulship. And what did he choose? The consulship, of course. A triumph is an honor, but the consulship is real power, the opportunity to pass necessary laws and secure a profitable governorship after his term ended. Caesar always knew how to choose what mattered most. And here we come to one of the most significant moments in his political career, the formation of the first triumvirate. Imagine the three most influential and ambitious men in Rome at that time. Gnaeus Pompey the Great, a celebrated general, a favorite of the soldiers, but somewhat clumsy in political intrigues. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, who had amassed a fortune through real estate speculation and Sulla's prescriptions, and who longed for the military glory he so lacked, and our Gaius Julius Caesar, a rising star, popular with the plebs, but in need of powerful allies to reach the highest offices. Each of them individually faced opposition from the Senate. The Senate feared Pompey becoming too powerful and was unwilling to ratify his arrangements in the East or grant land to his veterans. The senators also disliked Crassus, considering him an upstart. As for Caesar, they simply feared him as a potential destroyer of the established order. And so Caesar, displaying considerable diplomatic skill, managed to persuade these two frenemies, Pompey and Crassus had long been rivals, to join forces. Thus, in 60 BC, this unofficial secret alliance, which historians later called the First Triumvirate, came into being. Its essence was simple. The three of us will do whatever we deem necessary in the state, and no one will stand in our way. It was, in effect, a conspiracy against the senatorial republic. Caesar got what he wanted. With the support of Pompey and Crassus, he was elected consul for 59 BC. His colleague in the consulship was Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, a protege of the Optimates and a staunch opponent of Caesar. And so began a year that went down in history as the consulship of Julius and Caesar, because Bibulus, after several unsuccessful attempts to obstruct Caesar, simply locked himself in his house, declaring all days unfavorable for assemblies and issuing edicts against his colleagues' actions. Caesar, however, relying on the support of the triumvirs and the popular assembly, acted decisively and assertively. He passed an agrarian law granting land to propertyless citizens and Pompey's veterans, despite fierce opposition from the Senate. When Bibulus tried to stop him, he was simply dragged from the rostrum and doused with filth. Yes, the methods were not the most refined, but they were effective. Caesar ratified Pompey's arrangements in the East and secured for the tax farmers, publicani, who supported Crassus, a reduction in the sum for tax collection in Asia. In short, all members of the triumvirate got what they wanted. And Caesar secured the most important thing for himself, the proconsulship of Gaul, Cisalpine and Transalpine, as well as Illyricum, for a full 5 years. Moreover, with the right to recruit legions and wage war at his own discretion. This was an unprecedented term and unprecedented powers. The Senate was furious, but could do nothing. Cato the Younger cried out that Caesar was leading tyranny into the citadel, but no one listened. Caesar had obtained what he needed, an army, a province offering the opportunity for major wars, and thus booty and glory, and removal from Rome, where his enemies might try to bring him to trial for his actions during his consulship. Gaul was to be his springboard to the pinnacle of power. He understood that true strength lay not in senatorial debates, but in loyal legions, and he intended to create an army that would follow him to the ends of the earth. The first triumvirate was a shaky alliance of 3 ambitious egotists, but at that moment, it worked. It paralyzed the Senate and allowed Caesar to lay the foundation for his future might. Of course, there were those who saw the danger. Cicero, for example, though trying to maneuver, expressed alarm in his letters about the death of the Republic. But most either feared or preferred not to notice where Rome was heading. Caesar, having completed his turbulent consulship, eagerly awaited his departure for Gaul. He felt that his hour had struck. Ahead lay years of grueling wars, brilliant victories, and brutal reprisals. Ahead lay glory comparable to that of Alexander. He didn't know all the details yet, but his intuition told him that Gaul was his destiny, and he was ready to meet it face to face. Rome remained behind with its intrigues, debts, and political battles. Ahead lay the unknown, but for a man of Caesar's temperament, the unknown was not frightening, but alluring. It was a field for his talents, for his ambitions, for his genius. And he had no intention of missing this chance. And so, in 58 BC, Gaius Julius Caesar, a newly minted proconsul, arrived in his province. And what a restless province it was. Gaul was not a unified state, but a conglomerate of numerous Celtic tribes, constantly feuding among themselves, yet sometimes capable of uniting against a common enemy. Rome controlled only the southern part, the so-called Narbonese Gaul, Provincia, hence modern Provence. The rest of the vast territory, what the Romans called Gallia Comata, or long-haired Gaul, was inhabited by freedom-loving and warlike Gauls. And Caesar, in theory, was supposed to govern a peaceful province and protect its borders. But he had entirely different plans. He needed a great war, great glory, great booty, and a loyal army. And a pretext for war was found very quickly. The Helvetii tribe, living in the territory of modern Switzerland, decided to migrate west to more fertile lands. And their path lay right through the Roman province or in its immediate vicinity. Caesar saw this as a threat, or rather, an opportunity. He forbade the Helvetii passage, and when they tried to break through, he routed them in several battles, the most significant of which was the Battle of Bibracte. Tens of thousands of Helvetii were killed, and the rest were forced to return to their homeland. It was a brutal, but effective beginning. Caesar immediately showed who was master here. Then came a request for help from the Aedui, a Gallic tribe allied with Rome, who were being pressed by Germans under Ariovistus, who had crossed the Rhine and settled in Gaul. Caesar again saw an opportunity. He demanded that Ariovistus leave Gaul. Ariovistus naturally refused. The result, another brilliant victory for Caesar. The Germans were defeated and driven back across the Rhine. In a single year, Caesar not only defended Roman allies, but also significantly expanded Roman influence in Gaul. His actions were, to put it mildly, bordering on an abuse of power. He waged wars without always having the Senate's sanction. But victors are not judged, especially if they send wagon loads of booty and slaves to Rome. And Caesar knew not only how to fight, but also how to publicize his successes. His Commentaries on the Gallic War is not just a historical document. It's a brilliant piece of propaganda, written in magnificent, clear, and concise language. In it, he appears as a wise, far-sighted, and invincible commander, caring for his soldiers and Rome's interests. Of course, he modestly omitted his miscalculations, cruelties, or legally dubious actions. But the Roman public devoured it. The following years were filled with continuous wars. Caesar conquered one Gallic tribe after another, the Belgae, the Nervi, who nearly routed the Romans in a bloody battle on the Sabis River, where Caesar personally plunged into the fight, banner in hand, inspiring his soldiers. The Veneti, a maritime tribe against whom Caesar had to build a fleet, the Aquitani. He made 2 expeditions to Britain. This was unheard of. Romans saw the misty Albion for the first time. True, Caesar failed to establish a foothold there, but the very fact of landing on the mysterious island made a huge impression in Rome. He twice crossed the Rhine, invading German territory to punish Germanic tribes for aiding the Gauls, and to show them that the Rhine was not such an insurmountable barrier for Roman legions. These were not so much campaigns of conquest as demonstrations of force. Caesar was not just a talented tactician, he was a brilliant strategist. He knew how to exploit the disagreements among Gallic tribes, setting them against each other. He was ruthless to those who resisted, but often showed mercy to those who submitted, of course, if it was to his advantage. His army transformed into a battle-hardened, incredibly effective military machine, blindly devoted to its leader. The legionaries adored Caesar. He knew many of them by name, shared the hardships of campaigns with them, and generously rewarded bravery. He paid them from his own spoils, of which there was plenty, more than they received from the state. He created an army for himself that was ready to follow him anywhere, even against Rome itself if necessary. And that moment was approaching. While Caesar was fighting in Gaul, the situation in Rome was heating up. The triumvirate began to crack. In 54 BC, Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's wife, died. She had been an important link between the two most influential triumvirs. Her death cooled their relations. And in 53 BC, a catastrophe occurred. Marcus Crassus, dreaming of military glory, invaded Parthia and suffered a crushing defeat at Carrhae. Crassus himself and most of his army were wiped out. The triumvirate ceased to exist. Two remained: Caesar, whose fame and influence were growing by the day, and Pompey, who remained in Rome, enjoying the support of the Senate, which was increasingly fearful of the Gallic proconsul's successes. Pompey, seeing Caesar's star rise, began to lean more and more towards the Optimates. He was jealous of Caesar's glory and feared his growing power. The Senate, in turn, saw Pompey as the only force capable of opposing Caesar. The situation in Rome became increasingly chaotic. Street riots, clashes between gangs of political supporters, assassinations, like that of the popular tribune Clodius, all created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. In this climate, Pompey was elected sole consul, effectively a temporary dictator, to restore order. Caesar, meanwhile, faced his most serious challenge in Gaul during the entire war. Nearly all Gallic tribes, weary of Roman domination, united under the leadership of the talented Arvernian chieftain, Vercingetorix. It was a general uprising. Vercingetorix understood that he couldn't match the Roman legions in open battle. He adopted scorched earth tactics, destroying food and fodder supplies in the Romans' path, and tried to lure them into traps. Caesar had a very difficult time. At one point, his position was critical, but he once again displayed his military genius, incredible energy, and determination. The culmination of this struggle was the siege of Alesia in 52 BC. Vercingetorix, with his main forces, had fortified himself in this well-defended stronghold. Caesar besieged him, building two lines of fortifications around Alesia, one against the besieged, the other against the huge Gallic army marching to Vercingetorix's aid. The Romans found themselves caught between two fires. It was one of the most grandiose sieges in history. Caesar personally directed the defense, appearing in the most dangerous places. In the end, after bloody battles, the Romans repelled all attacks and forced Vercingetorix to surrender. The rebellion was crushed. Gaul was finally conquered. The price of this victory was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of Gauls were killed or sold into slavery. Caesar was cruel, but he achieved his goal. Now, all of Gaul lay at his feet, and he had the strongest and most loyal army in the Roman world. The conquest of Gaul was Caesar's triumph, but simultaneously a prelude to a new, even more terrible war, a civil one. While he was crushing the Gauls and sending caravans of booty to Rome, his enemies in the Senate were not idle. The Optimates, led by such irreconcilable figures as Cato the Younger, saw Caesar as a mortal threat to republican institutions, or what was left of them. They feared his popularity, his army, his boundless ambitions, and their main ally in this struggle was becoming Gnaeus Pompey, the very same Pompey who had once been Caesar's father-in-law and political partner in the triumvirate. But now, everything had changed. The deaths of Crassus and Julia had severed the last threads connecting them. Pompey, remaining in Rome, gradually drew closer to the senatorial aristocracy. He was flattered to be considered the defender of the Republic against the overreaching proconsul. Perhaps he himself was beginning to believe in this role. Or maybe it was simply envy of Caesar's successes and fear of losing his position as the first man in the state that pushed him down this path. The term of Caesar's proconsular command in Gaul was nearing its end. By law, he was supposed to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. This meant his enemies would immediately bring him to trial for numerous violations committed during his consulship and the Gallic Wars. Conviction would be almost inevitable, and that meant the end of his political career, exile, or even worse. Caesar understood this perfectly. Therefore, he sought the right to stand for consulship for the following year in absentia. This would allow him, by transitioning directly from proconsul to consul, to maintain immunity from prosecution. At first, Pompey seemed not to object. But then, under pressure from the Optimates, his position hardened. A complex political game began, full of intrigues, ultimatums, and mutual accusations. Caesar proposed compromises. He was willing to disband most of his army if Pompey, who commanded troops in Spain, though he himself remained in Italy, did the same. But the Senate, incited by Cato and other hawks, demanded unconditional surrender. Caesar must lay down his command, disband all his troops, and appear in Rome for trial. Mediators shuttled between Rome and Ravenna, where Caesar was with his 13th Legion. Tension mounted daily. Caesar wrote letters to the Senate, trying to appeal to justice and common sense, but his proposals were rejected. He felt he was being cornered, and he was not the man to let himself be cornered. In early January 49th BC, the Senate passed the so-called Senatus Consultum Ultimum, final decree of the Senate, effectively declaring Caesar an enemy of the state and granting Pompey unlimited powers to defend the Republic. The tribunes of the people, Mark Antony and Quintus Cassius Longinus, who tried to defend Caesar's interests, were expelled from the Senate and fled to him in Ravenna. This was the last straw. Caesar realized that a peaceful solution was no longer possible. He faced a choice: submit, which meant political death, or take the extreme step, start a civil war, and he made his choice. On the night of January 10th, 1149 BC, Gaius Julius Caesar, with his 13th Legion, reached the Rubicon River, which separated his province of Cisalpine Gaul from Italy. Crossing this river at the head of an army meant declaring war on the Senate and the Republic. According to tradition, Caesar hesitated for a long time, pondering the consequences of his step. He understood that this was the point of no return. And it was then, they say, that he uttered his famous phrase, "Alea iacta est." The die is cast, and he gave the order to advance. It was a daring, almost insane move. He had only one legion, about 5,000 men, while Pompey had far more troops in Italy and other provinces. But Caesar counted on his reputation, the loyalty of his soldiers, his popularity with the people, and the indecisiveness of his opponents. And he was not mistaken. News of the crossing of the Rubicon caused panic in Rome. The senators, who only yesterday had been threatening Caesar with all sorts of punishments, were bewildered. Pompey, who had boasted that he only needed to stamp his foot and legions would spring from the earth, was unprepared for such a rapid turn of events. He failed to organize the defense of Italy and decided to retreat south and then cross over to Greece to gather forces and fight Caesar there. Caesar, meanwhile, moved through Italy with incredible speed, encountering virtually no resistance. City after city opened its gates to him. His army grew with soldiers and volunteers joining him. He showed mercy to prisoners, Clementia Caesaris, thereby winning the sympathy of even former opponents. This was a brilliant propaganda move. He showed that he was fighting not against Romans, but against a handful of arrogant senators who had usurped power. In just 2 months, almost without bloodshed, Caesar gained control of all Italy. Pompey, with a significant part of the senators and troops, managed to cross over to the Balkans. Rome was in Caesar's hands, but this was only the beginning. Ahead lay a difficult and bloody civil war that would engulf almost the entire Mediterranean world. Caesar would have to fight not barbarians, but fellow Romans, experienced commanders, and hardened legions. The stakes were incredibly high. At stake was not only his life and career, but the very future of Rome. The Republic was already in its death throes. The question was, what would replace it? And Caesar, by crossing the Rubicon, took responsibility for answering that question. He did not know how it would all end, but he was determined to see it through to the end. He was a gambler who had wagered everything, and the game was just beginning. He could not turn back, even if he wanted to. The bridges were burned. Ahead lay only war, only the struggle for absolute power. He changed not only his own destiny, but the destiny of Rome, the destiny of all Western civilization, and the world would never be the same. So, Caesar is in Rome. Pompey and his senatorial party are in Greece, gathering an army. But our hero wastes no time. He understands that Pompey is the main threat, but first, he needs to secure his rear. And his rear is Spain, where Pompey had strong and loyal legions under the command of his legates. To leave them behind him would be the height of imprudence. Therefore, Caesar, after a very short stay in Rome, where he managed to calm the population, implement some urgent measures, and of course replenish his treasury, not even disdaining the state coffers, moved swiftly to Spain. The campaign in Spain was short, but brilliant. Caesar, using his favorite tactics of rapid maneuvers and surprise attacks, surrounded and forced the Pompeian troops to surrender near Ilerda. He again showed mercy to the vanquished, letting the soldiers and officers go home, taking from them only an oath not to fight against him. This was a smart decision. He not only avoided unnecessary bloodshed, but also won supporters by displaying his magnanimity. Having secured Spain, Caesar returned to Italy and began preparing for the main event, the war with Pompey. Meanwhile, Pompey had not been idle. In Greece, he had assembled a huge army and a strong fleet. Many Eastern kings and rulers supported him. He controlled the sea, which made it difficult for Caesar to cross. But this did not stop Caesar. In early 48 BC, despite winter storms and the blockade by Pompey's fleet, he managed to transport part of his army from Brundisium to Epirus. It was a risky operation, but luck was on his side again. A grueling campaign in the Balkans began. Caesar's position was very difficult. He had fewer troops than Pompey, he experienced supply problems, and his army was cut off from Italy. Pompey, on the other hand, occupied strong positions, and his fleet dominated the sea. At one point, Caesar even tried to personally cross back to Italy in a fishing boat to hasten the arrival of Mark Antony's remaining legions, but a storm prevented him. When Antony finally managed to break through and join Caesar, the situation improved somewhat but remained tense. Several clashes occurred, including a major battle near Dyrrachium, where Caesar suffered a serious defeat and was nearly completely routed. His soldiers were forced to retreat, sustaining heavy losses. It was a severe blow. Pompey was triumphant. His advisors urged him to finish Caesar off, but Pompey, perhaps fearing a trap or overly confident in his victory, did not pursue his retreating enemy with sufficient vigor. This gave Caesar a chance. He managed to lead his army to Thessaly, where there were more provisions, and let his soldiers rest. Pompey followed him. He was confident in his numerical superiority, especially in cavalry, and that victory was already in his grasp. Many noble senators in his camp were already dividing up future positions and the property of Caesar's supporters. They urged Pompey to fight a decisive battle. And so, on August 9th, 48 BC, near the town of Pharsalus in Thessaly, the two Roman armies clashed in a decisive battle. Pompey had about 45,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. Caesar had only 22,000 infantry and about 1,000 horsemen. Pompey's advantage seemed overwhelming. Pompey's plan was simple. His powerful cavalry was to crush Caesar's right flank, get behind him, and decide the outcome of the battle. Caesar foresaw this. He selected several of the best cohorts from the third line of his legions and placed them as a reserve behind his right flank, ordering them not to throw their pila, but to use them as spears, aiming for the faces and eyes of the horsemen. When Pompey's cavalry, led by the talented commander Titus Labienus, Caesar's former closest associate in Gaul who had defected to Pompey's side, fell upon Caesar's flank, it initially had success. But then Caesar's hidden reserve came into play. The unexpected and ferocious attack by the infantrymen with spears at the ready stunned Pompey's horsemen. Many of them were young aristocrats, unaccustomed to such fierce resistance and fearful for their handsome faces. Pompey's cavalry wavered and fled, leaving his infantry's flank exposed. Caesar immediately threw his fresh reserves into the fight, and his veterans, hardened in the Gallic wars, descended upon Pompey's legions. Deprived of cavalry support and attacked from the flank, they could not withstand the onslaught and began to retreat, and then to flee. Pompey, seeing that the battle was lost, abandoned his camp and fled the field. Caesar's victory was complete and devastating. Pompey's losses were enormous, about 15,000 killed and over 20,000 captured. Caesar's losses, only a few hundred men. The Battle of Pharsalus became the turning point of the civil war. Pompey's army ceased to exist as an organized force. Pompey himself, fleeing for his life, reached Egypt, hoping to find refuge there with the young King Ptolemy III, whom he had once favored. But Ptolemy's advisors, fearing Caesar's wrath, had other ideas. As Pompey was disembarking, he was treacherously murdered. His severed head and ring were presented to Caesar when he arrived in Alexandria a few days later. It is said that Caesar, upon seeing the head of his former son-in-law and one-time ally, now his chief enemy, wept. Were these tears of sincere regret or a well-acted performance? Who knows? But the fact remains. Caesar's main adversary was dead. However, the war was not yet over. Pompey's supporters, Cato, Scipio, Pompey's sons, raised new armies in Africa and Spain. Caesar faced several more years of struggle to definitively establish his power. But after Pharsalus, few doubted that he would become the master of Rome. He had demonstrated not only his military genius, but also incredible luck, which always seemed to accompany him at decisive moments. He had once again risked everything, and won again. And ahead of him lay Egypt, with its ancient mysteries, political intrigues, and one very young, very intelligent, and very ambitious queen named Cleopatra. And this visit to Egypt would add another vivid, exotic, and romantic chapter to his already incredible biography. Arriving in Alexandria, Egypt, in the autumn of 48 BC, in pursuit of the fugitive Pompey, Caesar found himself entangled in a web of local dynastic intrigues. Egypt at that time was formally an independent kingdom, but in reality, it was under strong Roman influence. The young Ptolemy the Thegned sat on the throne, but real power was in the hands of his advisors, the eunuch Pothinus, the general Achillas, and the rhetorician Theodotus. It was they who made the fateful decision to kill Pompey, hoping to earn Caesar's gratitude. But they miscalculated. Caesar, as we recall, reacted to this gift not at all as they had expected. Perhaps he genuinely felt some semblance of respect for his vanquished foe, or maybe he simply did not want anyone else deciding the fate of Roman citizens, even enemies. Besides, the murder of a man like Pompey at the hands of Egyptians was an insult to Roman majesty. Caesar decided to stay in Alexandria to settle the dispute for the Egyptian throne between Ptolemy the Thegned and his elder sister and, according to Egyptian custom, wife, Cleopatra VII, whom Ptolemy's advisors had exiled from the capital. Caesar had both formal grounds for this. He cited the will of their father, Ptolemy Thegned Auletes, who had asked the Roman people to be its guarantors, and practical considerations. Egypt was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, and control over it was very important for Rome, as well as for Caesar himself, who needed money to pay his soldiers and cover other expenses. And it is here that Cleopatra enters the stage. She was about 21 years old, intelligent, educated. She spoke several languages, ambitious and possessed, according to contemporary accounts, incredible charm and charisma. She understood that her only chance to reclaim the throne was to secure Caesar's support. But how could she meet him if Alexandria was controlled by her enemies? And then, according to the famous legend recounted by Plutarch, Cleopatra had herself secretly delivered to the palace where Caesar was staying, wrapped in a carpet, or, according to another version, in a bed linen sack. When this package was unrolled before Caesar, the young queen emerged. Caesar, who was by then over 50, was captivated by her boldness, intelligence, and undoubtedly, her feminine allure. Thus began one of the most famous romances in history. Whether it was purely a political calculation on both sides, or if passion truly ignited, is still debated today. Most likely, it was both. Cleopatra needed Caesar to regain power. Caesar needed a loyal ruler in Egypt, and perhaps he was simply captivated by this extraordinary woman. He openly sided with her, which enraged Ptolemy the Thegned supporters. An uprising broke out in Alexandria, known as the Alexandrian War. Caesar, with a small detachment, found himself trapped in the royal quarter, cut off from his main forces. He had to engage in heavy street fighting. He even nearly drowned when his ship was sunk in the harbor. It is said he swam holding important documents in one hand and his general's cloak in the other. During these battles, the famous Library of Alexandria burned down, or at least a significant part of it, an irreparable loss for world culture. The situation was critical, but reinforcements reached Caesar, and after several months of fierce fighting, he managed to suppress the revolt. Ptolemy Thegned drowned in the Nile while fleeing. Cleopatra was proclaimed Queen of Egypt, formally alongside her younger brother Ptolemy XIV, but real power was in her hands. Caesar spent several more months in Egypt. He made a famous journey up the Nile with Cleopatra on a luxurious barge. It was like a honeymoon. The result of this liaison was the birth of a son, whom Cleopatra named Ptolemy Caesar, and whom the Alexandrians nicknamed Caesarion. Caesar, though he did not officially recognize him as his heir, he already had a daughter, Julia, and Roman law did not recognize marriages to foreigners, seems to have felt paternal affection for the boy. But affairs in other parts of the Roman world could not wait. While Caesar was visiting Egypt, his enemies were not idle. Pharnaces, son of Mithridates Eupator, a longtime enemy of Rome, took advantage of the civil war and invaded Asia Minor, capturing several Roman provinces. Caesar had to leave Egypt and Cleopatra urgently. He landed in Syria, quickly assembled troops, and marched against Pharnaces. The campaign was lightning fast. At the Battle of Zela in modern-day Turkey in August 47 BC, Caesar utterly defeated Pharnaces' army. It was after this victory, according to tradition, that he sent his famous dispatch to Rome. Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. 3 words that perfectly reflected the swiftness and decisiveness of his actions. After this, Caesar set about restoring order in Asia Minor and then returned to Rome. But not for long. The Republicans, Pompey's supporters, had assembled a new large army in Africa under the command of Cato the Younger and Metellus Scipio. King Jubethorn of Numidia also joined them. Caesar once again had to go to war. In early 46 BC, he landed in Africa. The campaign was difficult. Caesar faced experienced commanders and a numerically superior enemy, but his military genius and luck were once again paramount. In April 46 BC, in the bloody Battle of Thapsus, he won a decisive victory. The Republican army was crushed. Metellus Scipio perished. Cato the Younger, besieged in Utica and unwilling to surrender to Caesar, committed suicide, becoming a symbol of implacable Republican virtue. His death made a great impression on his contemporaries, and even Caesar, it is said, regretted that he could not pardon Cato. Though knowing Cato's character, he would hardly have accepted such a pardon. After the victory at Thapsus, Caesar returned to Rome as its undisputed master. He celebrated 4 magnificent triumphs over Gaul, Egypt, Pharnaces, and Juba, but not over Romans to avoid unnecessary resentment. Rome rejoiced. It seemed the civil war was over. Caesar was showered with honors and offices. He was proclaimed dictator for 10 years. His statues were placed alongside those of the gods. He began to implement wide-ranging reforms aimed at restoring the state after decades of turmoil and wars. But one pocket of resistance remained: Spain, where Pompey's sons, Gnaeus and Sextus, along with Titus Labienus, had gathered the last Republican army, and Caesar, no longer young and weary of endless wars, had to set out on campaign once more. This was to be his final campaign. The final act of the bloody drama of the civil wars unfolded in Spain. Pompey's sons, Gnaeus and Sextus, together with the tireless Titus Labienus, Caesar's former legate and now his sworn enemy, managed to gather considerable forces. They acted with great cruelty, and the war in Spain took on a particularly fierce character. Caesar had to personally lead the army. This was no longer the swift campaign like at Ilerda. The Republicans fought with the desperation of the doomed. The decisive battle took place on March 17, 45 BC, near the town of Munda. The battle was incredibly hard fought and bloody. At one point, Caesar's legions wavered under the enemy's onslaught, and Caesar himself, it is said, was on the brink of despair. He threw himself into the thick of the fight, shaming and inspiring his soldiers. It is said he later confessed that he had fought many times for victory, but at Munda he had to fight for his very life. In the end, thanks to the steadfastness of the veterans of the X-Legion and a tactical cavalry maneuver, Caesar managed to turn the tide of the battle. The Republicans were routed. Titus Labienus and Gnaeus Pompeius the Younger perished. Only Sextus Pompeius managed to escape, and for many years continued to engage in piracy in the Mediterranean, causing considerable trouble for Caesar's successors. The Battle of Munda was Caesar's last major victory. The civil war, which had lasted almost 5 years, was finally over. Caesar returned to Rome as the absolute victor. Now no one could dispute his power. The Senate vied to lavish honors upon him. He was proclaimed Father of the Fatherland, Pater Patriae. His statues were erected in temples, and he was granted unprecedented powers. In early 44 BC, he was appointed dictator for life, dictator perpetuo. This was a direct challenge to Republican traditions, where dictatorship had always been a temporary emergency measure. Caesar concentrated immense power in his hands. He controlled the election of magistrates, commanded all armies, managed the treasury, and issued laws. In effect, he became a monarch, though he tried to avoid the royal title, which had been odious to Romans since the expulsion of Tarquin the Proud. But in essence, his power was kingly, and Caesar began to implement grand reforms aimed at restoring and transforming the Roman state, which had been exhausted by decades of civil wars and political instability. He reformed the calendar, creating the very Julian calendar that, with minor modifications, we still use today. He planned large-scale construction projects in Rome and throughout Italy: new temples, basilicas, theaters, roads, and the draining of marshes. He cared for his veterans, granting them land in colonies established throughout the empire. He streamlined provincial administration to reduce the abuses of governors. He granted Roman citizenship to many inhabitants of the provinces, especially in Gaul and Spain, promoting the Romanization of these territories. He tried to combat luxury and corruption. He planned the creation of public libraries. His energy and the breadth of his vision were astonishing. It seemed he wanted to remake the entire world. Many of his reforms were progressive and necessary. He sought to create a more efficient and just system for governing the vast empire, one with which the old republican institutions could no longer cope. But his methods and his unlimited power provoked growing discontent and fear among a part of the Roman aristocracy. Many senators, even those who owed their positions to him, saw him as a tyrant, a destroyer of liberty, libertas, and republican traditions. They were frightened by his popularity with the army and the plebs. His arrogance, real or attributed to him, irritated them. Rumors circulated that he intended to proclaim himself king and move the capital to Alexandria or Ilium, Troy. There were ample grounds for such rumors. For example, when Mark Antony, during the Lupercalia festival, attempted to place a royal diadem on his head, Caesar demonstratively refused, but many considered this merely playing to the crowd. His relationship with Cleopatra, who had arrived in Rome with her son Caesarion and was living at Caesar's villa, also added fuel to the fire. The Romans disliked the foreign queen and feared her influence over the dictator. In such an atmosphere, a conspiracy began to brew. At its head were Gaius Cassius Longinus, a talented commander resentful of Caesar for insufficiently recognizing his merits, and Marcus Junius Brutus, a descendant of the legendary Lucius Junius Brutus, who had expelled the last king from Rome. Brutus was a man of complex moral principles, an admirer of Stoic philosophy. Caesar treated him with great affection, almost paternally. There were even rumors that Brutus was his illegitimate son by Servilia, Caesar's longtime mistress and Brutus's mother. But Brutus, under the influence of Cassius and other conspirators, as well as under pressure from his ancestral legacy as a fighter against tyranny, concluded that assassinating Caesar was the only way to save the Republic. About 60 senators joined the conspiracy, including both former Pompeians pardoned by Caesar and his recent supporters. They considered themselves liberators, liberatores. They planned to kill Caesar at a Senate meeting on March 15th, the Ides of March, 44 BC. On the eve of this day, as stories tell, there were many bad omens. Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, had a terrible dream and begged him not to go to the Senate. Caesar himself felt unwell, but Decimus Brutus, another conspirator whom Caesar trusted, managed to persuade him to go, saying that the senators had already gathered and were waiting to bestow new honors upon him, and that a refusal would be taken as an insult. Caesar yielded to persuasion. He did not know he was walking to his own execution. He, who had faced death so many times on the battlefield, who had survived shipwrecks, conspiracies, and betrayals, found himself defenseless against the daggers of those he considered his friends, or at least loyal citizens. Fate was preparing to deal him its final mortal blow. And so it was, the morning of March 15th, 44 BC, the Ides of March, a day that would forever enter history as a symbol of betrayal and political assassination. The air in Rome, as we have said, was electric. Omens, rumors, troubling dreams, all contributed to an oppressive atmosphere. Calpurnia, Caesar's wife, implored him to stay home. It is said that Caesar himself hesitated, but Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, one of Caesar's closest associates, and, cynically enough, one of the key conspirators, managed to change his mind. He remarked with irony that it would be strange if Caesar canceled a Senate meeting because of a woman's dreams, and reminded him that on this very day, the senators were to discuss granting him the title of king outside Italy for the campaign against Parthia. This last argument apparently worked. Caesar, who was already preparing a grand campaign to the east to avenge Crassus and extend the empire's borders to India, could not miss such an important meeting. On his way to the Curia of Pompeii, the old Senate house in the Campus Martius had burned down, and meetings were temporarily held there. Someone tried to hand him a note warning of the conspiracy, but brushing aside numerous petitioners, he never read it. Fate, or chance, played its fatal role. When Caesar entered the assembly hall, the senators respectfully rose. The conspirators surrounded him, pretending they wished to make some request. Lucius Tullius Cimber, one of them, grabbed his toga, as if petitioning him, and pulled it from his shoulder. This was the signal. Publius Servilius Casca struck the first blow. His dagger only grazed Caesar's neck. "Villain Casca, what are you doing?" Caesar managed to cry out and, according to one version, wounded Casca with a stylus, a sharp writing instrument. But then the others set upon him. There were many of them, and each sought to land a blow to become an accomplice in the great deed. Caesar initially tried to resist, fighting back, but when he saw Marcus Junius Brutus, whom he loved and had favored, among the attackers, he, according to tradition, uttered his famous phrase, "Kisse teknon," "You too, my child," or "Et tu, brute," and ceased to resist, covering his head with his toga, so as not to see the faces of his assassins and to die with dignity. He fell at the foot of the statue of his vanquished enemy, Pompey the Great, bleeding profusely. 23 wounds were found on his body, though only one, to the chest, was deemed fatal by the physician Antistius. Thus ended the life of the man who had conquered Gaul, won the civil war, become the unlimited ruler of Rome, and begun to reshape the world according to his will. He was 55 years old. The conspirators rejoiced. They ran out into the forum with bloodied daggers, shouting, "The tyrant is dead, the republic is saved." Brutus delivered a speech, trying to explain the motives for the assassination to the people. But the crowd's reaction was not at all what they had expected. Instead of joy and support, there was fear, confusion, and then anger. The Romans, especially the plebs and the soldiers, loved Caesar. They remembered his generosity, his reforms, his victories. They did not see him as a tyrant, but as a defender of their interests. Caesar's body lay in the Curia for several hours until 3 slaves carried it home on a litter. The conspirators found themselves isolated. They barricaded themselves on the Capitoline Hill, fearing the vengeance of Caesar's supporters. Mark Antony, consul and Caesar's closest associate, was initially bewildered and went into hiding, but then quickly brought the situation under control. He managed to negotiate a compromise with the Senate. Caesar's assassins would receive amnesty, but all of Caesar's decrees and laws would remain in force. This was a cunning decision. It avoided immediate civil war and gave Antony time to gather his strength. The key moment was Caesar's funeral. Antony delivered his famous speech over the body, so brilliantly depicted by Shakespeare, showed the people the dictator's blood-stained toga, and read his will. And in his will, Caesar left 300 sesterces to every Roman citizen and his gardens on the banks of the Tiber for public use. His principal heir, however, was declared to be not Mark Antony, as many had expected, nor his son by Cleopatra, Caesarion, whom he apparently could not recognize under Roman law, but his great-nephew, the 18-year-old Gaius Octavius, adopted by him in the will and given the name Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. This was a blow to both Antony and the conspirators. Antony's speech and Caesar's generosity, demonstrated even after death, decisively swayed the mood of the crowd. Riots broke out. Enraged citizens hunted for Caesar's assassins, ransacking their homes. The conspirators were forced to flee Rome. Caesar's assassination did not lead to the restoration of the Republic, as Brutus and Cassius had naively believed. On the contrary, it plunged Rome into a new, even bloodier civil war that lasted for more than a decade. In this war, almost all the liberators perished. Many of those who fought for Caesar's legacy also died. In the end, the victor was the young Octavian, who, displaying remarkable political talent, cunning, and ruthlessness, managed to eliminate all his rivals, including Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and establish a new political regime in Rome. The Principate, effectively a monarchy under a republican guise. He became the first Roman emperor, Augustus. So, was Caesar a conqueror? Unquestionably. His Gallic campaigns are a model of military art and strategic thinking. Was he a dictator? Yes, and for life. And his dictatorship, though it brought temporary order and important reforms to Rome, became the final nail in the coffin of the republican system. Was he a god? During his lifetime, they had already begun to deify him, and after his death, he was officially numbered among the gods as Divus Iulius, the divine Julius. His name became a title for subsequent Roman emperors: Caesar, Kaiser, Czar. Caesar's personality is incredibly complex and contradictory. He was a brilliant commander, an astute politician, a talented writer, and an orator. He was charming and ruthless, generous and cynical, exceedingly ambitious, and capable of magnanimity. He knew how to risk everything and win where others would have failed. He changed Rome and the entire ancient world. His legacy is immense and is still felt today. From the Julian calendar to the very concept of empire, he was a man who dared to defy fate and reshape history according to his own will. And though his life was cut so tragically short, his shadow loomed over Rome for many centuries. He showed that one man, possessing will, talent, and a loyal army, could shatter age-old foundations. And this lesson was well learned by those who came after him. The path to power and betrayal. This is perhaps an accurate description of his life. He rose to power through blood, intrigue, and war, and fell victim to the betrayal of those he considered his own. But even death could not erase him from human memory. Gaius Julius Caesar remains one of the most vivid and influential figures in world history, a legendary man whose life still provokes debate, admiration, and condemnation. Caesar's legacy proved far more enduring than the lives of his assassins and even the republic they so desperately tried to save. Paradoxically, It was Caesar's assassination that accelerated Rome's final transition from republic to monarchy. The liberators wanted to bring back the past, but they only cleared the way for the future, a future in which Rome would be ruled by emperors. Octavian, Caesar's young and initially underestimated heir, proved to be a master of political maneuvering. He first allied himself with Mark Antony and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, forming the Second Triumvirate. This alliance, unlike the first, was official and possessed extraordinary powers. The Triumvir's first act was to institute new proscriptions, ruthlessly dealing with their political opponents and confiscating their property to finance the war against Brutus and Cassius. Among the victims of the proscriptions was the great orator Cicero, who had fiercely denounced Mark Antony in his Philippics. The Triumvirs then crushed the armies of the liberators in 2 battles at Philippi in Macedonia, 42 BC. Brutus and Cassius, defeated, committed suicide, just as Cato had done. It seemed Caesar's cause had been avenged, but the struggle for power did not end there. The triumvirate soon disintegrated. Lepidus was sidelined and then stripped of power altogether. The main rivals became Octavian, who controlled the western part of the empire, and Mark Antony, who had established himself in the east and fallen under the spell-binding charm of the Egyptian queen Cleopatra. Their romance, a continuation of the love story between Cleopatra and Caesar, was not only the passion of 2 extraordinary individuals, but also a major political game. Antony dreamed of creating a Hellenistic empire in the east, where he would be the supreme ruler, and Cleopatra, his queen. He distributed Roman provinces to his children by Cleopatra, which caused outrage in Rome. Octavian skillfully used this in his propaganda, portraying Antony as a traitor who had betrayed Roman interests for a foreign sorceress. The culmination of this confrontation was the naval battle of Actium in 31 BC. The fleet of Antony and Cleopatra was defeated by Octavian's fleet under the command of Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, but their cause was lost. The following year, Octavian invaded Egypt. Antony, having received a false report of Cleopatra's death, committed suicide. Cleopatra, unwilling to be paraded in chains in Octavian's triumphal procession through Rome, also found a way to end her life, according to legend, with the bite of a poisonous snake, an asp. Caesarion, the young son of Caesar and Cleopatra, was killed on Octavian's orders, who reportedly said, "It is not good to have too many Caesars." Thus ended the Ptolemaic dynasty, and Egypt became a Roman province. Octavian remained the sole ruler of the vast Roman state. He did not proclaim himself king or dictator. He was smarter. He formally restored the republic, but in reality, he concentrated all key positions and levers of power in his own hands. The Senate bestowed upon him the honorary title Augustus, the exalted, the sacred, and under this name, he entered history as the first Roman emperor. He ruled long and wisely, establishing the Roman peace, Pax Romana, an era of relative stability and prosperity that lasted for nearly 2 centuries. And all of this would have been impossible without Caesar. It was Caesar who cleared the path for Augustus. He destroyed the old republic, which could no longer cope with governing the sprawling empire. He created an army loyal to its leader, not to the state. He showed how sole power could be achieved. Augustus merely completed what his adoptive father had begun, but he did so more subtly and cautiously. What then was Caesar's influence on subsequent history? It was colossal. 1. Political system. Caesar, in essence, laid the foundations of the Roman Empire. Although he did not manage to formalize his regime completely, His actions made a monarchical form of government inevitable. The title, Caesar, became synonymous with imperial power and was used not only in Rome, but also in subsequent empires: Byzantium, the Holy Roman Empire, the Russian Empire, Kaiser, Tsar. 2. Military affairs. His commentaries on the Gallic War and commentaries on the Civil War became classics of military literature, studied by commanders for centuries. His tactics, strategy, ability to manage troops and logistics all became a model for emulation. 3. Calendar. The Julian calendar, introduced by Caesar with minor adjustments, the Gregorian calendar, is still used by us today. This is one of his most enduring legacies. 4. Spread of Roman culture. The conquest of Gaul led to the Romanization of vast territories in Western Europe. The Latin language, Roman law, and Roman customs spread there, laying the foundations for the formation of modern Romance peoples and languages: French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian. 5. Image in culture. Caesar became one of the most popular historical figures in world literature, art, theater, and cinema. From Shakespeare to Bernard Shaw, from Handel's operas to Hollywood blockbusters, his image continues to inspire and intrigue. He became a symbol of ambition, genius, power, but also of tyranny and betrayal. 6. To cross the Rubicon. The die is cast. Et tu, Brute. These phrases associated with Caesar have become idiomatic expressions that have entered many languages worldwide. So, who was he? A conqueror, a dictator, a god? He was all of these and more. He was a product of his era, an era of crisis and transformation. But he was also the creator of a new era. His personality is so immense that it is difficult to fit him into any definitive framework. He was a man of action, unafraid to take responsibility and change the world around him. His methods were often cruel and cynical, but his goals, at least as he saw them, were aimed at creating a stronger and more stable state. Do the ends justify the means? This question remains open when we speak of Caesar. But one thing is certain: Gaius Julius Caesar is a figure without whom the history not only of ancient Rome, but of all Western civilization is unimaginable. He left a mark that has not faded in 2,000 years, and his story continues to teach, inspire, and caution us. He was a man who dared to be more than just a man, and for this he paid with his life, but gained immortality in the memory of posterity. His story is an eternal tale of power, ambition, genius, and human nature in all its manifestations.